Some years back, when Patrick Moynihan was not a senator of the state of New York, but was an advisor to President Nixon, he was responsible for trying to get through Congress a welfare reform program called the Family Assistance Plan, form of the negative income tax. Moynihan failed. He wrote a book about that failure, and it's a fascinating book. Why did he fail? Well, there are a number of reasons, but one of the most important to which he refers was a welfare establishment. Enacting that law would have put out of business a lot of people who had nice jobs, exerting real influence in administering one or another welfare program, because this would have been a substitute for AFDC, for food stamps, for a half a dozen other programs. Now, again, don't misunderstand me. None of these, I'm not saying these members of the welfare establishment opposed it out of a deliberate malice or with the belief that they were doing harm. Not at all. But everybody is perfectly capable of persuading himself that what's in his interest is in the nation's interest. And the bureaucrats, here I am, I'm running a bureau. We're doing good work. We're doing important things. You mean to say you're going to put me out of business? That's not the way to improve the national welfare. And so you get a concentrated group of governmental bureaucrats who make it more and more difficult to follow policies which are in the general interest if they tend to conflict with their own bureaucratic interest. Let me go from this general level of analysis and get down to specific cases. Let me first give you some numbers to show you that I'm not making up the problem I'm talking about. We have had an enormous number of welfare measures passed over the past 50 years in the name of helping the poor. The total expenditures on all these programs, the total expenditures by the federal, the state, and the local governments, excluding private expenditures, excluding private charity and the rest, total governmental expenditures amount today to 1/7 of the national income. The government, to put this in terms that are more meaningful, the government publishes figures on the number of people who are regarded as being in poverty. Now, I warn you, that's a wholly arbitrary number. These levels that divide people between the not poor and the poor are arbitrary, but take them for what they are. The government estimates something like 12% of the people are in what they call low-income status or are poverty. Suppose I divide the total amount of money spent on these programs by the number of people labeled poor. The answer comes out to $9,000 per person, or $36,000 per family of four, to take the mythical family of four so much beloved by statisticians. Compare this with the average per capita income of everybody. The per capita income, per person income of all the people in the United States, after taking away taxes, disposable income, is $6,500. If that $9,000 per person were really going to the poor, they'd be among the rich. That income given to them would put them in the top 20% of the income distribution. But of course it isn't going to the poor. It's going to you and me. It's going to the governmental officials. It's going to the various programs that are enacted in the name of helping the poor, but end up helping you and me. Over and above the waste of resources through these welfare state measures, they have further effects, which I think are very serious from the point of view of the maintenance of a free society. In the first place, calling on the government to solve problems strains that social fabric of agreement on basic values that is necessary to maintain a stable society. In order to have any kind of a stable society, you have to have people agree with one another. You have to have them have a certain minimum common set of values and beliefs. And you want to avoid straining that set of beliefs. Now, the great virtue of the market is that people who hate one another in other respects can cooperate with one another on the market without any difficulty. As I often say, when you buy bread at the grocery, you don't know whether the wheat from which that came was grown by a black or a white, an Indian or a Chinaman, Mohammedan, a Christian, a Jew, somebody you like, somebody you dislike. And it doesn't make a darn bit of difference. And even though you and he disagree violently on every issue, you can cooperate, he can produce the wheat and you can buy the bread. That's the great virtue of the market, that it permits cooperation without conformity, without people having to agree with one another. Political mechanisms have the opposite arrangement. You have to enforce conformity on people. You have to decide on the standards. You have to decide on who is going to pay, who is going to get. And when 51% of the people say one thing and 49% say the other, 100% do what the 51% say. As a result, the more you have to use political mechanisms, the more you tend to strain the social fabric. One of the effects of resort to welfare state measures is to promote regionalism and divisions within our society. In the United States, this is shown up by the growth of ethnic particularism, ethnic divisiveness. We used to be proud of being a melting pot in which we got a common set of values while each of us was able to go our own way with respect to our local customs and our local backgrounds. But now that there is a great deal to be gained by forming cohesive minority blocs, political entrepreneurs are out forming blocks of people from particular ethnic backgrounds, and they are now going to become more cohesive blocks, which tends to divide the society. The welfare state measures develop an acceptance on the part of the public at large of regimentation. It develops it on the part of the poor, who get their benefits by being told what to do. I remember years ago, a fellow who was doing a study of the welfare programs in New York City came to me, and he said, "I've been reading your book, Capitalism and Freedom," he said, "and you talk about the conflict between growth of government and human freedom." And he says, "You don't know what you're talking about." He says, "You don't have your freedom interfered with very much. If you really want to see this conflict in action, you go down to Harlem and you look at the people who are on welfare. They can't move from one place to another without getting the permission of their welfare supervisor. They can't put in a telephone without getting it approved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They are the people who are having their lives regimented." Well, it's not only they. Those of us who are subject to Medicare have to know about the forms we have to fill out. Those of you who are students who are getting federal aid or loans or whatnot know about the conditions to which you have to subscribe. All of us who know that our future benefits are going to come from the government have to think three times before we engage in actions that might prejudice our future acceptability. So the effect of the growth of the welfare state is also to develop an acceptance of regimentation. Furthermore, it undermines the ethical and moral standards of the people. It undermines those standards by instilling the notion that nobody is responsible for himself, that if something is wrong, somebody else is responsible for it. Now, of course, what happens to people is not wholly a result of their own behavior or their own actions. Society does have an effect. Outside forces do affect them. But unless you adopt broadly the view that individuals are to be responsible for themselves, you cannot get, in my opinion, a decent free society.